This Choircast podcast is brought to you by Go Wide, Reimagining the Landscape of Theology by Martha Elias Downey. This book invites readers to expand their theological, spiritual, and relational horizons by sidestepping the notions of hierarchy and verticality. Go Wide employs the lens of spaciousness to explore biblical stories, theological concepts, and the nature of God, showing how biblical narratives often disrupt the status quo. Pick up Go Wide, Reimagining the Landscape of Theology, now available on Amazon.
Welcome to the Unbelief Podcast, your journey, actually our journey together beyond inherited beliefs to a spirituality that works for you. I'm your host, Jeremy. I'm a deep skeptic, also a pastor. We can fix that later, right? No? Damn. You have made it to another book club episode where we take a sacred text, unearth all of the interesting cultural insights and academic insights so that we can get to the deeper truth of it and find ways that it can help us understand who we are and form beliefs in God and spirituality and humanity that work for us and help us become the best version of ourselves, as well as find a purpose greater than ourselves. That's what we're doing here. And today we are starting in Genesis chapter 11, verse 10, the part that goes right after the Tower of Babel, which was our last episode where we talked about technology, the invention of bricks, all kinds of really interesting stuff. And I'll be honest, when you pick up at verse 10 here, it seems incredibly boring because it's just a genealogy. Right. It is. This is the account of Shem's family line. You know, he was this old and he had this kid. And then that kid was this old when they had the next kid. And to be honest, most people skip over this part, and for good reason. It's incredibly boring. But there's some really interesting insight here. Insight into this text, insight into the Bible in general. And I think it's worth taking just a moment and nerding out. I hope you don't mind. That's kind of what we do here. But when you start here, you will most likely, if you were a person that's sort of reading through the book of Genesis, you'll say, oh, yeah. There was another genealogy very recently that sort of led us up to the flood. And when you look at the two genealogies, you're going to say, hey, wait a second. These aren't the same, right? It doesn't show the same people descending from the same people. And that's okay, because the point of genealogies are not about the record, the legal record of who had who. They are about symbolism. And there is so much symbolism in this one. And the first one is that it's 10 generations long. As you move forward through the text, you will actually come upon several lineages that are 10 generations long. And that is important because anytime you find a lineage that is 10 generations long, it signals something important. It signals the passage from one eon to the next, that we're in one era and now we're going into another area. And this lineage takes us through from the primeval period, which is sort of the cosmic stories, to the patriarchal one, through the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob story. And what's really interesting is that you have these primeval cosmic sort of epic stories of the global flood and the Tower of Babel and the creation of everything. And then when you come to the story of Abram, who eventually is renamed Abraham, it's everyday life of these people. It's about marriage and death and conflict with sort of competing wealthy people and rulers and all of that. This is very much the story of God in the everyday life of the people. And that's an important transition to make, because now we aren't talking in epic terms. We're talking in everyday terms. And it's helpful for us when we are reading this bit of the story to understand that the insights we're looking for are sort of everyday insights. Though there is obviously bigger, deeper things, we need to also be taking stock of, okay, what is the everyday insight here? What does this mean for my life when I wake up tomorrow, right? And it says 2 years after the flood. And right away, we've got a problem because it says Noah was 500 years old when the flood came, and 600 years when he had Shem, which is where this one begins. And that sort of messes up the ages about how old Shem is in this one. But again, everything here is symbolic. And the lifespans of each of these people are also symbolic. There's been a bunch of different sort of proposed symbolic schema for what these lifespans mean, but there's actually no consensus on the meaning of that symbolism in the academy. But one of the pieces when it comes to the age is we do see this decreasing age from the flood to the patriarchs, and that is, it's similar to other stories at this time, like the Sumerian Kings text. And it seems to indicate this sort of paring down or confining of the human lifespan to something smaller and more normal, that they don't have, each person doesn't have as big of an impact. And all of that, it looks like it's sort of this consequence of the flood and of people moving on after that. So we go all the way down, we have all these really interesting names: Selah, Eber, Peleg, Reu, Serug. Nahor is the father of Terah. And after being the father of Terah, Nahor lived 119 years, had other sons and daughter. After Terah had lived 70 years, he became the father of Abram. That's the person who's going to later be called Abraham, the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. The father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. That is interesting if you've been paying attention to lineages, which, let's be clear, nobody does. But the writer here is pointing to something, because there is another important figure who in their lineage says that they had 3 sons, and that person is Adam. And you see that in chapter 5, which is, it's a callback to Adam, but it's also a sort of symbolic rendering, a symbolic underscoring of the importance of this story, the importance of Abram, because Abram is the father of all of the nation of Israel. In a sense, he is the Adam of Israel. It all begins with him. And that's important. That's important because it situates us in this story in a way that we can say, okay, we need to listen here, because yes, it's going to be about the everyday, but there's also this bigger thing going on. There's also this thing with Abram. He is going to be the father of something really important. What comes after him yeah, he is the beginning of something big. And another interesting little tidbit here is that this is 365 years, which, of course, you recognize the number 365, right? That's the number of days in a year. And this is sort of it's like 365 years. It's like the number of days in a year in years. And I love that because it's also kind of tying back into the Adam story in that you have a whole revolution, in a sense, a historical revolution of all of the seasons, right? And now, after winter and spring and summer and fall, we have come back again to the beginning of the year. We've come back again to the beginning of the story. We've made a full revolution from Adam to Abram. We've gone full circle, and now we're going to see what's next. And it also points to the fact that people are people, that history is history, that things that happened before will happen again. It's 365 years, and it's 365 years because, in part, it's seasonal. Things repeat themselves, which, if we're talking about our everyday lives, wow, yeah. Things repeat themselves over and over again. Now, you can alter them. You can look back at your history. You can look back at your own personal life, and you can say, okay, I need to learn from this. I need to set up new boundaries. I need to set up new systems to help myself be a better person in this area, to change my life in some way. I've got to set this up. But if you do nothing to influence the system, it's going to be winter and spring and summer and fall, and then winter and spring and summer and fall over and over again, because that's how it works. Without intervention, we keep doing the same things over and over again. And here in this story, we're actually about to see some real intervention happening as Abram begins his part of the journey. But before we leave the lineage, and I know that you thought you would not hear someone talk for like almost 15 minutes about this lineage, but let me tell you, there's just so much in here, and we could keep going, but we're not. Before we leave it though, before we leave this lineage, it's important to note that we don't see these people in many other places. You get a little bit about Shem, but when you get to like Reu, this is the only place Reu's ever mentioned. And that's important because Reu has a single role to play in the story of humanity, in the story of God's people. Reu is a person who needs to live 32 years and become the father of Serug, so that Serug can be the father of Nahor, that Nahor can be the father of Terah, and that Terah can have Abraham as his son. And this, I think, is something that can bring deep hope and a sense of a greater purpose to our lives in a profound way. Like, that's all we know about Reu. Reu did not have anything that happened in his life that was worthy of note at this level, right? I mean, we know Reu had kids. He had money, he had land, he had animals, like he ate, he, had marriages of his children. We know he had a life, he had all kinds of things. But there wasn't anything about Reu's life that feels like epic or cosmic or any of that, except that Reu was right there in the middle of the lineage that led to Abram. And all of these people are like that. We don't have anyone who has like this super major role to play. We get a little bit more about some of them here and there. But these people are significant because they were the foreparents of Abram. Which says to us, shows us a deeper reality. You don't always know what your life is about. You don't always know what your life is contributing to the world. And though you may think in the midst of your life that you know what it's about, that you know what role you're playing, you may just be Reu. And the goal of your life is to be part of the giving birth of the person who brings God more fully into this world and into covenant with humanity. I love this concept because you see this in other lineages, people who you don't know who they are, who you don't find anywhere else, but they're important. Their lives were important because of something they had absolutely no idea would happen in their life while they were there. They had no idea. And let's be clear. Not everybody feels like they know why they have been put on earth. If I'm honest, if I track back in my life throughout all the different sort of eons or eras of my life, if you'd asked me the purpose of my life, like why I was put on the earth, when I was super young, I would have told you I was put on the earth to be an actor. When I was a little bit older, I was put on the earth to be a senior pastor of random churches. And then later I thought I was put on the earth to be a youth pastor. And now I am part of this community of people who is trying to deal with our religious trauma and chart a new course and find beliefs that work for us. And probably in 10 or 15 years, I will tell you that the point of my life was something else. And who knows? Maybe one of those things was ultimately the point of my life. But there's also times when our life feels pointless. And that too is okay. This lineage shows us that sometimes the point of our life is ultimately unknowable by us. Yeah. When you're feeling the pointlessness of life, of your existence, you might turn back to this lineage and read it and read all the names that you have never heard before and you will never hear after it and say, okay, you know what? I have no idea what my life is about, but maybe I'm just Reu. Maybe the point of my life is really big. Like I'm an important figure in the sort of history of humanity, but I won't know that because that will happen 100 or 200 years after I die. And you want to talk about everyday truth that helps, man, that's some of that. And that's where we're headed in the rest of the book of Genesis. And I'm not going to leave you hanging. We are not going to only do this episode on Genesis, chapter 11 at the end of it, where it's all this boring lineage, I promise. And one thing to note right here before we get into chapter 12 also is that this little section right here at the end, Abram's family, we have all the details. And then it gets to Sarai, Abram's wife. And it says, now Sarai was childless because she was not able to conceive. That Sarai is barren. And it says it right from the beginning. Like, the first thing we know about her is that she can't have children. And oof, I mean, in that culture, wow, that's a hard thing. In that culture, when you were a woman who was not able to bear children, it was thought that you were cursed, that you had done something horribly wrong that made you that way, that God was punishing you in some way. And that is something that the longer you are barren, the longer that you feel that way, the more it's internalized. I don't know if you've ever had something like that about yourself, but this like negative thing that is going on in your life that people are saying about you, eventually you start saying it about yourself, or you start taking it on as your identity. This one thing that it's all that I am. And whatever it is. Here, it's barren. I am barren, which would be like, I am cursed by God. I am not holy enough. I am not fulfilling my job, even all the way back to the beginning, like the job of humanity to populate the earth. I am not fulfilling this core thing. I am somehow completely broken. That's what's being internalized here. And it keeps going. It keeps going because in just a minute, we're going to see something that's going to hit hard for Sarai. And without introducing her here like this, you might miss it. And you might miss it in general because of the patriarchy, because we want to read the story about Abram, but there's this other story going on with Sarai and what she is going to be feeling and experiencing and how she is going to value herself and how she is going to act and hurt other people. It's all starting right here at the very beginning. Sarai is barren. She's one of those impure, unclean women. Oof. Right here. Right from the beginning. We're also now going to go in what may be the most important passage for the Jewish people. The beginning of the Abraham story is important and is called back to over and over again throughout the rest of the Old Testament and the New Testament. Like, this is a big moment. So we start in chapter 12. And in chapter 12, it begins with a really important moment. But let's pause, fast forward just a second to something that's kind of interesting before we get into the epic moment. Kind of interesting is the fact that in just a couple of verses, it says that Abram was married to Sarai, his half-sister. And she had the same father, Terah, as Abram. We get that in Genesis chapter 20. And that marrying a half-sister is actually forbidden in the book of Leviticus in chapter 18, in chapter 20, and in Deuteronomy in chapter 27. And this is an important point in the midst of this to understand the book of Genesis in general, and really the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. That is that as far as academics can tell, as far as scholars can tell, what we have in these texts, in the book of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, what we have in these texts is an amalgamation, a compilation of multiple sources. There was a priestly source, a Yahwist source, a Deuteronomist source. There's an Elohist source. Multiple sources that ultimately get combined in. And so you will find conflicts. And some of the conflicts they're just conflicts. They're just inaccurate things about the Bible. Some of the conflicts, though, will come from the merging of these multiple sources. And as you look at them, you can get a sense that, this part is older than the surrounding text. It's going to come from an older tradition. And that's actually what this weird conflict where Abram being married to his half-sister and then that being forbidden in later texts, it suggests that it is of a later that because of the conflicts with the later rules against this looks like this is an older section, right? And it's authentic. It wasn't changed. They just left it in there because that's the tradition. And yes, it conflicts with Leviticus, but that likely means this part is older. Okay, back to the beginning. Chapter 12, it says, the Lord said. And God is speaking. This is an important moment. God says, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. And then there is this poetic, prophetic promise that God gives Abram. It says, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And look, you cannot get bigger than that. The promise of God here is epic. It is huge. It sort of is foreshadowing of something really important. And it also just is a foreshadowing of what we're going to see in the book, right? In the rest of the book, in the story of Abram, you are going to see that whoever blesses Abram is blessed, and whoever curses Abram is cursed. And this will play out over and over again, where if somebody does something wrong to Abram, it doesn't go well for them. But that's not the most important piece of this, at least to me, as far as looking at the deeper truth for our lives. The most important piece of this is that Abram is going to be a blessing, not to his children, just to his children, not just to the nation of Israel, but Abram is going to be a blessing to all of the families of the earth. All of the families, everybody who ever lives is going to be blessed through Abram. And this is important for us because it shows us something spectacular. That in this moment, God is saying, you remember Adam? Right? 365 years ago. Do you remember that guy? Like, do you remember Remember the first dawn and how that went? I'm going back there. I'm going back there with you, and I'm going to start with just you, just your family. But we're gonna build this bigger and bigger and bigger until it is the whole earth. And later in the New Testament, you actually get callbacks to this, where the writers in the New Testament are looking at this and saying, hey, remember that about Abram? Yeah, Jesus is that. This movement of Christianity is breaking all of the boundaries down. It's pushing down all of the walls between God and people. It's not just Jewish people. It's all the non-Jewish people. It is everyone. It is all the families on the earth. They're calling back to this moment, to this story, and saying, yeah. This here in the New Testament, this Jesus thing, that is rooted in Abram, in the story of his life. Wow. Yeah. All nations, all the people of all the nations. We've got to pause here before we go on, because remember what we said? We said that this was going to hit hard for Sarai. Yeah, it does, because the whole premise of this promise, the whole beginning of this, is that Abraham will have many, many descendants. And really, at this level, at this point, it feels like Abraham will have many, many children, many children of his own. And Sarai is barren. Sarai is unable to conceive. It's a shame in her culture. For her, it is a reflection of some sort of deep internal and often spiritual brokenness, at least according to the way that culture thinks. And the promise to Abraham, or Abram at this point, requires she bear children, and she can't. So it hits hard. Sarai, hearing this in the background, when Abraham comes and tells her, I imagine she is happy for Abraham, trying to put on a happy face, and yet dying inside because she has internalized this brokenness, owned it as her own fault. So yeah, the Sarai story is sort of hidden in between the cracks of the Abram story at this point, but it is no less poignant for us. This idea that we can take on labels, take on identities that other people have given us and that our culture has given us, and we can allow them to give us a perception of ourselves that takes really good things and turns them into bad things for us, that causes us to lose hope in a different possible future because we have allowed ourselves to internalize these messages. I know I've done that over and over and over, and I don't always notice it. Until something changes, until that message is broken, or until I have enough mental space to think back on my thoughts and my patterns and say, oh, you know what? I'm doing the Sarai thing. So then we have in like verses like we're gonna go with Abram, and we're gonna go to Haran, and Lot's going with them, and what's interesting though is Abram starts on the northern side of the promised land. So this is one of those things you don't really catch in the midst of it. He starts on the northern side of the promised land. And when he goes, he ends all the way down in the Negev. And that's sort of the southern boundary of this future promised land that we end up hearing really a lot more about later. But when God says God's going to give this land to him, the land that is the promised land that we will keep hearing about, Abram is said to sort of walk the length of it. Abram goes from the top to the bottom. Abram sees all of the promised land in his lifetime in that one trip. It's almost giving you this sense of, no, God promised Abram the promised land, and even though we don't get it till later, even though it's not fully realized till later in the story, Abram surveyed it. But Abram doesn't understand that. And we get over and over Abram saying, but God, you promised this, you promised that. Like, why isn't it happening? Why is that stuff not becoming my reality? And right here we see that Abram actually saw it all. He didn't miss it. It just was bigger than him. And I love that insight because that is something that plays out every day. Right? I know when I look back on my life, there's times where I took this long journey. I didn't know I was taking this journey, and I didn't know that it was something bigger than me. And then all of a sudden, I'm in a new place with a new group of people, and somebody says something about their life, and I'm like, oh, yeah. I've been on that path. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was actually going from the top to the bottom of the promised land. That, yeah, you need to know how to get there. And I know how to get there. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was surveying this whole area that somebody else was going to inherit, and somebody else was going to need my insights. Which, in my best moments, when I keep this part of the Abram story in my head, I can look at wherever I am, and if I am confused, if it seems meaningless, or if it just seems really hard, in my best moments, I can say, I don't get it. I don't know why my life is this hard right now. I don't know why my life seems this meaningless right now. But maybe at some point in the future, I'm going to realize I've been on a long journey. I've charted this trail from the previous part of my life to this part of my life, and somebody is going to ask me about something, and I will know the way because I walked it myself. Yeah. Abram journeyed on by stages towards the Negev. And then we turn to his relationship with his spouse and his family. It says, now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt. And this is a difficult thing because this is the first time we hear Egypt, and he's not going to stay there, but it's a foreshadowing. It's a brilliant foreshadowing. And that's where we leave it this week. We have this wonderful community of people that's called Not Church, We call it Not Church because one of our members said it's like not church. It's like all the things that I want for church, like conversations about spirituality and religion and people who care about us, about each other, and like hold space for each other or pray for each other or whatever. But nobody is there telling you you're going to hell because you don't believe the right thing. That's not church. And it is this beautiful community. It's really like what I want as well. People who have deconstructed or in the midst of it, this is what you're looking for. And if you want to be part of it, just go to patreon.com/skepticpastor. That's patreon.com/skepticpastor. $3 gets you in. It's $3 because we aren't asking people to give 10% of their income. It's just pay for what you get. And you pay for it. If at some point it stops working for you, you just stop paying for it. So skepticpastor.com/Patreon. Also, if you can help us out, leave us a review, 5 stars, 4 stars, whatever is max, and tell people how much you love this content. We would appreciate it. Those reviews really help wherever it is you listen to this podcast. That would be super great for us. That's it. That's the podcast. Shout out to the Choir Network, to Patheos, to Matthew and Keith, who make everything happen. Now, get out of here. Go do something to make the world a better place. Okay? We'll see you next time.